All right, y'all. So, hey, my name is Joanna Hobson, and today I was a part of the Queen's Care Summit. And so, just a little bit about Queen's Care. This is a nonprofit organization based in Chicago, Illinois. They have blessed me in so many ways I can't even explain, but to reroute back to what I'm doing here today, they brought me in to talk about how stress affects mental health and people with HIV, and really went to learn when your rest can be resistance. So, just a little bit about me. I am a social neuroscientist. So, I study how stress affects pain, how you cope with pain, and your mental health. So, things like depression, anxiety symptoms, especially in racial minorities and people with HIV. So, it's nice to meet y'all if you don't know me already, but here's a little bit more about me. And so I am originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I started doing outreach at Lane College. I love my LC. That is in Jackson, Tennessee. And so here was where I learned, more things about public health and domestic violence, as well as how to advocate for mental health. And then on the side of that, I was doing research in genetics. And so this really fueled my passion to go to graduate school. And I went and got my PhD in behavioral neuroscience, or you can say psychology, at UAB in Birmingham. And that's where I really started to shape my passion in HIV and pain research. So why is this conversation important? Why should you care? Well, Black women account for the largest amount of new HIV diagnosis among women as of 2022. And the rates of new diagnoses among Black women are 10 times the rate amongst white women and 3 times the rate among Latina women. So you start to ask the question of, okay, what's really going on? Why is there this disparity? Well, even beyond disparities with HIV diagnoses, when Black people in general find out they have HIV, it's hard to be linked to care and to really keep their viral loads down. So you really have to know somebody that knows somebody, but then also have a trusted healthcare professional. So in 2022, they talked about how 88% of Black people were diagnosed. And of this percentage, only 64% were linked to care, and 53% were virally suppressed. So that's where you get into words like detectable and undetectable and why these things are important. Most importantly, among this, whether you have HIV or you don't have HIV, Black women are disproportionately affected by depression and anxiety and symptoms of PTSD. So it's important to have this conversation and really understand how stress affects your mental health and also puts you at risk. And so, just a brief overview of kind of the history where we started. And so, from the 1980s to 1990s, HIV really predominantly affected men who sleep with men, and African Americans in general. And let's kind of break down the term men who sleep with men. So, this is not a part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but instead heterosexual men who are sexually involved with men. And so, going back to the early 1980s to the 1990s, this was known as the pre-HAART era, or highly active antiretroviral therapy. So at this time, AIDS was the number one cause of death, and that had a lot to do with no treatment and not really understanding what the condition was. And so moving on to 1995 to the early 2000s, that's when HAART was developed, and the concern was less about death tolls but more so about disparities in comorbidities or other conditions. So things like opportunistic infections, pneumonia, you name it. And so now treatment has advanced. And so the World Health Organization is moving towards making sure that everyone knows their status. And when you know your status, making sure that you're treating your condition. And then from there, making sure you're virally suppressed. Importantly, there's some research going around now that talks about a fourth 90, and that's making sure that people who have HIV, who are diagnosed, treated, and virally suppressed have a good health-related quality of life. So that's where research like chronic pain and social determinants of health come in, because we really want to hear from the community to understand how can we meet you where you are. So, where my research, like the basis of it, is really understanding how stress impacts health, especially in racial and sexual minorities. And so we know that stigma and discrimination, they continue to drive racial disparities in HIV and mental health outcomes. So on the right, you'll see that people who identified as Black or African American in 2022 were in the lead for new HIV diagnoses. And then following that was people who identified as Hispanic or Latino. Following that was people who identified as white. But then as you go down to say people who identify as Asian, American Indian, that number's as small as 1%. And so you really start to ask the question, well, how can we bridge this gap? So one of the most common comorbidities in people with HIV is chronic pain. And so chronic pain affects 90% of people with HIV, and it's associated with symptoms of depression, trauma, and traumatic symptoms, as well as insomnia. The way chronic pain works is it's a sensory and emotional experience. And so you experience some pain, your brain sends a signal to your peripheral nervous system, and then they kind of just communicate back and forth about what's going on. And in turn, you have this emotional response. So your brain is perceiving that this pain is happening and it can affect you via, say, psychological distress, depression, and things like that. So if you leave your pain unmanaged, it can add additional stress to your life, and I really want to talk about what this means. So, pain can be influenced by biological aspects. So, things like how you age, your stress physiology, inflammation, and then also your genetics. So, sometimes these things really just can't be controlled. But then also psychological aspects. So, consistent stress, anger, things like depression and anxiety, but also social factors. So, if you've ever been stigmatized, when sometimes when people mention HIV, they use the words clean or dirty or um and those words sometimes people unconsciously don't know that they're stigmatizing others, but I think it's important to bring awareness to how this stigma can not only affect people with HIV, but it can make them vulnerable to a debilitating condition, and we don't want that. And so that can kind of lead to social isolation and not feeling supported by your peers or your community. One of the things that I wanted to add to this biopsychosocial model of pain is that economic component. So right now we're in a climate where incomes are being affected, your health literacy and your resources are being affected, but also neighborhood deprivation. So what do you have access to in your neighborhoods that can really help push that pen forward and teach you more about your health? One of the things I want to mention here is the groups that are at risk for HIV associated pain. And so, even though there's a disparity in HIV diagnoses, people who are mostly affected, so Black women, men who sleep with men, older adults, as well as people who live in low income communities, and the LGBTQIA plus community are at risk, whether you have or don't have HIV. So, it's very important to recognize these things and really get in front of them to minimize the effects they have on your quality of life. So here's where my research kind of comes in. So um this picture from this paper that I am highlighting is by Bridget Goosby, and she really talks about how racism and stress overall affects health. To me, racism is a form of social pain and it really induces stress. So, what she said in this article was that you experience racism or any sort of traumatic or social event, and even sometimes a pain incident. I like to look at ostracism as a form of social pain. And so you experience this, your brain recognizes it as a stressor, and then that sends a signal to your HPA axis or your stress system. From there, your body responds to the signal with a fight or flight response. So that's what it kind of looks like. The dilated pupils, or your heart beating really fast, or you're sweating. So every time you sense, or even sometimes unconsciously, sense experience of stress, this is what's happening in your body. And over time, if this is chronic, it can affect your body's systems. So this is called allostatic load. And basically what it means is wear and tear on your mental capacities as well as your physiological systems. So this manifests as conditions like hypertension or high blood pressure, diabetes, and other cardiovascular issues, as well as chronic pain. And so from there, your genetics is affected as well as your kids, their kids, and your perception of your life's experiences are affected, and your behavior can change. So you can be on a spectrum where I'm more resilient and I don't internalize these things, but you can also be on a spectrum where you internalize the racist things that happen to you. And so what my research does is try to find that real sweet spot. And so not necessarily internalizing what you're going through, but not negating it either. And so that's why my work is important. This brings me to the topic of John Henryism. So John Henryism, in a nutshell, is just the need to prove them wrong. Them meaning anyone that decides that they want to ostracize you or stigmatize you for the sake of anything that you have going on. And so John Henryism is this act of actively coping with stigma and feeling like you have to work twice as hard just to get the same result. And this is associated with symptoms of heightened vigilance. So heightened vigilance is basically like that hyper awareness or alertness every time you leave the house, and um, feeling like you have to change your appearance or change the way you talk or look just so that you don't have to go through racism or any sort of form of stigma and discrimination. There's also cardiovascular issues associated with John Henryism. So if you think about that fight or flight response I was just talking about, you consistently, your brain is consistently perceiving racism as a form of stress. This racism or this form of discrimination can come as a micro or macro aggression. And if you consistently cope with this, whether you're aware of it or not, it can really cause stress to your body systems. And so this can kind of influence accelerated aging and mortality, especially in people with HIV. So here's where my work is shifting. It's really talking about taking your power back and letting your rest be resistance. And so the rest is resistance framework that I'm really trying to build within my research was informed by Trisha Hershey. And so Trisha Hershey, I just found out about her recently and I love the saying. And basically what she talks about is not really overexerting yourself to prove a point. Not really overexerting yourself to give a response, but really letting your rest be that resistance and preserving your energy. And so I fell in love with the concept. And now, my research is leaning towards things like journaling and talk therapy. And so I can speak firsthand to journaling and talk therapy working for me. It has worked wonders in my life, especially with my own depression. But also, research is showing that it's helping other people, as far as people with HIV and pain, or people with just pain, as well as people who don't have either one. It shows to really manage how you deal with pain, but as well as your stress that influences that pain. And it also provides you with a space of confidentiality. And when you talk to a trusted professional, it has shown to improve depression and PTSD symptoms. So we are aware, that sometimes people don't have access to things like a journal or a therapist. And so if you ever have questions about where to find a therapist, an affordable therapist in your city or state that takes your insurance or the lack thereof, let me know. And if I don't know somebody, we're going to find somebody that do. All right. And then physical activity. So this is another thing that I'm really leaning towards. And it just really highlights how something as simple as taking a brisk walk for 30 minutes and playing your favorite music playlist, doing a good stretch in the morning, and tying in that Tai Chi. For me personally, prayer. Every morning when I'm on the way to work, prayer has really worked for me to handle, my stresses on a daily basis, but also boost my mood. Because as I said before, I do have chronic pain. I also do have depression, and sometimes they do get the best of me. And I have to practice some of these very things that I talk about in my research as well as my study. And then one of the things that we don't talk about enough is leaning on your support system. I struggle with this a lot, but I feel like leaning on your support system, doing things like calling a friend, going over to hang out, or even, having them over. Studies show that it alleviates stress. It really creates those endorphins. It really helps you to not feel alone. And then most importantly, it reduces those feelings of internalized stigma and discrimination. So those feelings where you apply those negative thoughts and beliefs to yourself. You start to believe what people have told you about yourself. And we really, at least with my work, I want to work to circumvent that and reverse that. And so this is another quote that I really like. I always use it in most of my presentations, and it's a quote by Toni Morrison. And basically, what she says is the function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work, and if depending on what type of work you do, it really affects your mental health. And so you really have to ask yourself, at what point, is enough, and you stop trying to prove who you are, but you accept what you are and what God has told you you are, and you go off and you be great. And so with that, this is some of the things that I know I'm working on in my research, but as well as in my personal life, and just trying to push out and advocate for the things that, I really value and I'm passionate about. Because sometimes in science, um, you get the niche that, you get, I guess, you dwell in it. And so you have to take a step back and realize where you are. And so when I made these bullet points, I was like, where am I? Like, where am I going? And these are the topics that I'm really excited about. So I really like the idea of resilience or adapting to or being able to recover from or adjust to stress. One thing I've learned about myself, in the past 5 years in this journey of self-discovery is I am very resilient. And there's so many Black women and Black people in general, women in general, that are so resilient, but they don't know that they possess those traits. And so I really want to influence that in my research and embody this holistic social pain treatment. And so resilience and physical activity. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in interventions that don't involve medicine. So things like yoga, journaling, pain and substance use interventions, music as therapy, or what they call music-induced analgesia. And so most importantly, I am in the process of developing a self-help journal for Black women. So just to kind of plug myself in there, outreach is one of my favorite things to do. It really helps me, to stay grounded and stay, based upon my principles and what I really care about, what I'm passionate about, and what my purpose is here on this earth. And so I felt like my way of really getting out into the community and spreading the word was through self-help journals, things like science communication, really advocating for mental health. At one point, I had a podcast they really talked about, mental health. It was called Mental Health Monday. So I really do plan to bring these things back out, spread it within a community, spread awareness because I know what it's like, to go through things and be ostracized. And I think that we are not too different, as far as people who have HIV or people who have depression. We all go through something. We're all stigmatized in some way. But the beautiful part about the Queen's Care Project, just to circle this back around, is they bring it all together in something such a beautiful way. It's a beautiful transition. I am blessed to have been able to interact with these women. Every time I come around, they teach me something, and it really just It's a great thing. So you guys will be seeing more of me. I'm not sure if I'll be doing these presentations in the form of a video, if I want more of an interactive conversation, but I feel like it's my duty to y'all to really share resources anytime I have a talk, but also share things with y'all that you may not see on a daily basis. And so thank y'all. That is my social media as well as my email, and I hope that everybody has the best day. Q&A. So this is from the webinar that we had earlier, but if you have any questions, if there's ever a moment where you don't know where to access something, so things like PEP and PrEP, if you don't know how to access mental health resources, if you are having a mental breakdown, you're in psychosis, please feel free to reach out to me. I may not be a therapist, but I am an advocate and I am a scientist, and I'm always going to stand for lifting each other up. And so, thank y'all so much for just giving me your ear. And I hope and pray that you can hear some more from me. Have a good day.